activated from the very beginning towards each other. They may get anxious because of what they're talking about, but they're probably not going to start arguing with each other in the second session.
Okay, so in the second session you think it's a little too early for self-compassion. You do think it's a good thing to have and to be able to do, but you think that it's unlikely that people become activated in the second lesson and will need self-compassion in a way.
Yeah, yes, I feel heard. Thank you.
Well, you might be right, Gertie. And I mean, it's hard to say. On the other hand, I feel like that it's also important to teach people techniques how to calm down themselves. And what we can very often see that we have communication breakdowns, real life situations where communication breaks down, where people are simply not able to give each other empathy. That does happen. And if they don't even know how to give themselves empathy, then they're completely lost. And I don't see a philosophical, well, maybe we, well, I have a different philosophy in a way. I'm a big fan of the Indian school of thought, which is called the, can write it down, it's hard to pronounce. It's called Achintya Veda Abheda Tattva. I haven't spelled it out. It's called Achintya, or I forgot an A. Achintya because it's the inconceivable, Veda, divided, and Anveda, undivided truth. And that is one concept which I learned in India about how actually it's a theological concept, because in India for a very, very long time, for hundreds of years, there has been a discussion between the monists and the Shankaracharya, which are also part of the Buddhists, and the theists, who basically were saying, one was saying, well, God is everywhere, everyone is God, there is nothing on this earth which is not God. So everything basically is God. God is this all-engulfing light, the everything, the Brahma Jyoti, the Brahman, and God is everywhere. So a little that kind of concept that everything is God. And then you had the theists. The theists were saying, well, God is a person and God is somewhere. Be the person male or female, that really depends who you're talking to in India. But God is an individual, the highest supreme being that governs over all other beings. And then you had another philosophical group, and they formed a synthesis out of these two stances, the one individualistic stance and the all-encompassing stance. And they were saying, well, God is both. At the same time, every being is part of God, but then again, God is still the supreme being, because at the same time, unconceivably, God is the supreme being apart from everything else. So God can be both. In the whole creation can God, and God still is the supreme being. And how he or she does it, how this supreme being does it, well, that's inconceivable. How is the individual being with its pea brain going to figure that out? And that is a bit theological concept, but I see it boiled down in very, very many aspects of life, that on the one hand, every person is an individual. And you cannot take away the individuality, especially in the West. We love our individuality, and people have a hard time to give up that individuality. Now, Westerners do become crazy if they are crammed up with other people all the time and do not have any retreat time, self-time, time for myself, you know, where you can cuddle up in your home in the safe space of your own walls and just be for yourself for time. That is also some, when Westerners are expatriates to India, that is something that drives them absolutely crazy because they are never alone.
Could I get a
And
reflection of what I've heard so far? Just quite a bit.
okay, okay.
Okay,
Sure.
so getting a little bit of an echo. You're saying that there's a kind of a theological, philosophical underpinning that you kind of follow with from the Indian tradition, and one school says that kind of God is this all-encompassing, and then another one is there's a point, sort of more individualistic, and you're saying there's another school that's kind of merging this too, that that God or people are individualistic, but also sort of a whole too, and that you're seeing that Westerners really like their individualism and need time for their individualism as well, and so you're kind of just sharing your basic philosophy of that kind of parallels what you're seeing with the Indian philosophy.
In a way, now,
No?
yeah, in a way that was an observation, and I think that is also from a scientific fact in a way. I mean, people have made this observation in a scientific way that people in the West are just quite individualistic for the good or for the worse. It can also be a virtue to be individualistic because you are not so much dependent on other persons. You're more self-dependent. But in the same way, it can be a vice because you are so much in the John Wayne spirit of having to do everything yourself. And but from a cultural point of view, from a social cultural point of view, I think offering people a synthesis of the group experience, because every Westerner is a group person. All human beings are group beings. That is one part of our nature, and allowing both the group person, the group consciousness, but also the individual consciousness. I think that is quite important, and it is not something which is in opposition. If you look at it from people can be both. They can be both individualistic and at the same time group persons. And as a matter of fact, we are every day. We are sometimes alone and we are in groups. And I don't think that self-compassion is, including that, even including the whole compassion concept. The Indians called it inclusivism. It's a great tactic to make something your own in a way.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that even scientifically it says that we can be individualistic as well as social, and it's just kind of a part of our nature? Or?
It is a behavior that we can watch in the Western world, that people are simply more individualistic than in the Asians, for example, or the Mediterranean people. Or the Catholics, as a matter of fact. The Catholics, in all the Catholic countries, people are, for whatever reasons, who knows. But in Latin America and in other countries, people are more group-oriented, and people in the Northern West European countries are more individualistic. There has been a lot of research in that train of thought, and it's not a bad thing. And empathy still works very much, and but I think offering people something for the individualistic traits that should also, I think it should also be in the training program.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not in the beginning, and maybe not in the beginning, but it should have its place, because people, I mean, let's face it, loneliness is one of the biggest things that people experience nowadays with the technological divide, and people are very lonely from time to time.
Mm-hmm.
They're even
So
lonely living in
living where?
Many people feel isolated living in families. I mean, on the outside they see well integrated, but in their inner being they don't feel understood. And of course, empathy will be the cure for that. But maybe but self-compassion and self-empathy, I think, is also a stepstone for reaching out to other persons. You know, if you do not have persons who are kind to you, then at least you can start becoming kind to yourself and let that radiate and become a more attractive person for other persons to actually get in touch with you and start rewarding relationships with you.
So what I was hearing there is that you're seeing that there's these different capacities people have, the social and individualistic. Northern Europeans are more individualistic. Southern Europeans, Latin Americans, Asians, maybe more social-oriented. And the curriculum should have space for all of these different, kind of be inclusive for all the different ways of being. So for individualistic as well as social. And the people who are kind of individualistic might be more lonely, like even in a family you can be very lonely, and so you're wanting some tools for how people who are kind of having these painful feelings can maybe kind of be supported in as well.
Yes, I feel fully hurt. And
Okay.
just one thing, since since this is recorded and somebody watches this, I'm talking, of course, about statistically the bell curve, right? That you know, 75% of all Westerners may be like that, and then you have the
You're
outliers.
generalizing. You're not making a blanket stereotypical statement. You're just making a generalization. There's a bell curve. We're just talking about generalities and not putting everybody into that category.
No, everybody can feel like an outliner.
And you're concerned that people might be watching this and you'll be stereotyping people. You want them to know. You want them to know that you're not thinking that. You're not putting them into a category.
Yes, of course. You always have to give people the feeling that they can be outliners, and that makes people happy, I found.
So if you're listening to this and you're an outlier, you're accepted, and we want to make you happy.
Such pleasers. Such accommodators.
You know, I've given this kind of seminars for quite a long time, and if you don't include the outlier option, then people can become really frustrated. And interestingly enough, most of the time, those people become frustrated who actually fit the description the best. But
so if you're watching this, you might be fitting the description the best, and you're upset. That's for good reason. At least that's Sasha's point of view from his long experience of doing workshops.
Don't post my private address, okay? I don't want to have any angry people standing in front of my door.
So actually, I would like to speak to Gertie, if you would be willing to reflect some of these thoughts. So the workshop, I'm imagining the workshop being more about fostering the empathy, you know, kind of being clear that it's about empathy and that we're trying to develop this empathic listening skill. Like this is like central to kind of what the 12 weeks is about.
So what's important to you is that we're developing an empathic listening skill, and you want it to be at the center of the course.
Yeah, and it's about, there's a lot of different ways to come to self-empathy. So even before going to self-compassion, or compassion in general, since it's a sub-piece of, I see it as the empathy pie, that we want to talk about the general space of empathy first. Because we can go into the specific areas, but let's talk about the general aspect of empathy to begin with.
So you see self-compassion as one sub-piece of the empathic curriculum, and you want to focus on the general term first.
Yeah, so there's like empathy, self-empathy, And then the slice of self-empathy is self-compassion. So even before going to self-compassion, I would want to talk about how do we foster self-empathy, which would be connecting with, with the positive as well as the painful parts of our experience. How do we celebrate the joy, the fun? It's like let's just not go to the pain right away. So.
To you, first comes empathy, then self-empathy, and then self-compassion. You want to focus on the joy first before we go to the painful parts.
Yeah, and I want to cover it all. I mean, I don't want to exclude anything. So I also see the synthesis. That follows with me that we have the capacity for being individualistic, and we have the capacity for our social connection. So those are capacities we have, and we want to talk about all the capacities we have.
It's important for you to have everything included. And now the second piece.
And address all of it. Speak to it all. Speak to the self and speak to the relationship part too.
You want to include both, to speak to the self and to speak to the relationship.
There is a part of the self, kind of the self, in the terms that I see it, that when we become afraid, and that actually has a shutting down of that broad sun, metaphor for shining. Our empathy is shining on the world. That when we become frightened or fearful, it actually starts inhibiting. It's the same metaphor as the amoeba, or not the amoeba, the see an enemy, it's out there, you poke it, and then it kind of like shuts down, it contracts, and it becomes focused on protection and self. So that's another piece, I guess.
So there is that fearful part in everyone that shuts down when we get fearful, and then the sun is darkened and there isn't that empathy part anymore, and you want that addressed as well.
Yeah, and the part is there's also what is self-empathy. There's a whole spectrum of ways that I've seen that we can have self-empathy and underneath that self-compassion. So for me, the best way for self-empathy is actually to be heard by others. It's this notion, when we have a baby, we don't tell the baby, now look at you, you need self-compassion, take care of yourself, be on your own, and pull yourself up by your bootstrap. You sit and you listen and you reflect, and it's through that reflection that the baby starts developing the strength and the capacity to be off on its own. So this reflection actually gives us the strength to be on our own, is kind of how I'm seeing it.
So do you feel there's a lot more to be said about what self-empathy means and what self-compassion means, and how to integrate that frightened child part, or that the frightened child part is easier integrated through the bi-directional empathic process rather than internal self-compassion?
Yeah.
Is that what you said?
Yeah, it's more even. The baby doesn't even need to be afraid. It just has its needs, and there's plenty of neuroscience about how babies actually learn through being seen and through the mirroring with the parents. They start mirroring the parents. Their language, actually, the babbling, the words, the babbling starts becoming pieces that they start reflecting words to the babbling, and their character gets developed. So it's the relationship that comes first in terms of just child development. And so I kind of see that being really important. This, how do we foster this empathic relationship, is a first step.
So you're thinking about learning as a process of being heard and seen and mirrored, and that in itself is a huge process of developing one's own self and ultimately self-compassion.
Yeah, and then later on, once we have that resilience that we've gained, from being seen, we're much, at least for me, I'm much stronger when I go out into the world. It's like having done empathy circles over and over again. going into stressful environments, I have a lot more capacity for dealing with the stress. It's just like this, there's this resilience that I feel in myself that I take with me, to deal with the stress. And then even when I feel really stressful, I'll send out an emergency call, and say, hey, I'm really feeling stressed. I need somebody to talk to. So, just getting kind of being heard by others kind of really helps me there too. So,
for you, your experience has been that being heard and empathically listened to builds resilience and prepares you to go out and go into more conflict-laden or ridden situations.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's kind of my view on the just bringing up. So I think it's really good to be talking about these different aspects because the clearer we get and better we can articulate, I think it's really going to help the curriculum. So I'm really glad for the chance to talk about this.
Yeah, I appreciate that we have this process and this dialogue when there are conflicting viewpoints that we can just explore and without having to feel that pressure that we have to decide right at this moment. And it's important to just be able to express the viewpoint and be heard.
Yeah, and keep going until we come up with because I didn't even see Sasha, his synthesis part, because that totally resonates with me because that's kind of my view too, is that synthesis. So I feel like I kind of understood more deeply what he was talking about, because I feel total resonance around the synthesis of the individual and the social aspects of it.
So Sasha's synthesis totally makes sense to you, the individual and the social aspects. You're not in disagreement there.
Yeah. Sasha heard. Thank you.
Good. Okay. I actually have to get going. Do we have any parting words or plans for the next meeting?
How about I would just throw out, what if we both, all three, kind of come up with some rough drafts around lesson 1 and 2, kind of start fleshing it out, and then we'll come together and continue the dialogues, and just keep using empathic listening. If there's any kind of differences, kind of work them through with empathic listening. So we're kind of using the process that we're going to be, teaching and facilitating. So for me, that really works well. And I hope everyone feels patient with this too.
Sure.
So that's fine.
You're not in a rush, are we?
No, we're not.
Okay, good.
Does everybody feel heard?
Yes, I feel heard. Thanks for asking. There are points I would like to make, but I can bit my tongue till later. Just maybe the one thing, I think one component of this self-compassion training is also that you increase self-awareness, which I think is, and yes, that doesn't really, the self-compassion group doesn't really have, a strong grip on that. I think in an empathy training, we should also do some self-awareness training, because for self-empathy, self-awareness is, I think, a very important skill, because if you're not self-aware of your own emotions, then sometimes you think that if you use perspective empathy or cognitive empathy, you think that the other person is thinking what actually you are thinking. So you're projecting your own feelings on other persons, and which is maybe the first, but maybe most common empathy mistake, that you project your own feelings into somebody else. So in order to be an empathic listener and also a good empathic person, I think it's important to be keenly aware of one's own emotions and feelings. And if you're not that, then you are just a terrible empathic person, because you think that other persons are what you are yourself. And so I think that we should incorporate also that into the empathic training program. And whether we call it self-empathy or self-compassion or whatever, it doesn't really matter how you call it. if we call it mindfulness or self-awareness. I think self-awareness might be a little better because not everybody has jumped on the mindfulness train now. If you call it self-awareness, having that emotional self-awareness as part of the course, because empathic listening will be much more stronger if you can differentiate between your own feelings and your vicarious feelings.
I'm all for that. Sounds good to me. In fact, I would say there's a whole school of tools around how do you connect to yourself like that, and focusing is one of them. I don't know if are you familiar with the focusing process, Gertie? So that's
Yeah.
all about tapping into a felt experience, and so.
So there's a lot more to be learned and taught around
Yeah.
self-awareness and not project or becoming aware of projections and differentiating between self and other, and becoming aware of sensory, motor, physical things. That is a lot more to be integrated. I agree.
Yeah. Yay. Okay.
Okay. I'm gonna have to run.
Okay. Bye.
Okay.